Until this moment, the Mongols had never lost. Cities burned. Kingdoms collapsed. Armies vanished. Every battle, theirs. But then, something changed. A force no one feared did the unthinkable. And for the first time, the world saw that the Mongols could bleed. For decades, the Mongol horde had seemed unstoppable. From the plains of Mongolia, their horsemen had swept across Asia like a living storm. They had crushed empires, razed cities, and brought kingdoms to their knees. Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, had fallen in 1258, its libraries burned, its scholars slain, its caliphs executed. To many, it seemed that Allah himself had abandoned his people, that nothing could halt the tide of the Khans. By 1260, the Mongols stood at the gates of the Levant. Their general, Kitbuka Noyan, commanded a hardened force of veterans, fierce warriors loyal to Hulagu Khan. They had already reduced Aleppo and Damascus to trembling submission. Their hooves shook the Holy Land, and both Muslims and Christians feared that soon there would be no resistance left. But fate was not finished. In Egypt, the Mamluks, slave soldiers who had risen from servitude to power, watched with grim resolve. Forged in the crucible of war, they were no ordinary army. Many were Kipchaks, Turks, and Circassians, men who themselves had once lived under the Mongol shadow before being captured, converted to Islam, and trained in the art of war. Their sultan, Kutuz, knew the terror of the Mongols firsthand. He also knew that submission meant annihilation. When Hulagu withdrew east with much of his army after the death of the great Khan monk, Kitbuka was left with a smaller but still deadly force to hold Syria. Kutuz seized the chance. Gathering perhaps 20,000 men, he marched north from Egypt to meet the invaders. At his side rode Baibars, a brilliant general whose cunning mind had already envisioned the trap they would lay. Their chosen battlefield was the valley of Jezreel, near the spring of Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath. The name itself carried weight, for here David had once slain the giant. Now, centuries later, another giant threatened to crush them. The Mamluks prepared with silent determination. Their cavalry polished their curved blades, their archers strung their bows, their armor glinted beneath the Levantine sun. Each man knew that if they failed, Egypt would fall, Mecca and Medina would be next, and the heart of Islam would be extinguished. But if they triumphed, they would prove that even Mongols could bleed. And the world would change forever. Kitbuka Noyan, the Mongol general left to command in Syria, was a warrior of iron resolve. A Nestorian Christian by faith and a veteran of countless campaigns, he was utterly devoted to Hulagu Khan. To his soldiers, he was both ruthless and fearless, a man who had survived the brutal purges of Mongol succession wars and had carved victory after victory across the Middle East. His army, though smaller than Hulagu's original host, was still formidable. Mongol cavalry filled the plains, their composite bows capable of piercing armor at terrifying range. Alongside them marched auxiliaries, Armenians, Georgians, and other local levies forced into service. Though perhaps only 10,000 to 12,000 strong, they carried the reputation of an empire that had never been defeated in open battle. As Kitbuka marched south into the Jezreel Valley, his confidence was absolute. He had crushed Aleppo, humbled Damascus, and scattered every force sent against him. He sneered at the news that the Sultan of Egypt dared to march north. "The Mamluks are slaves," he told his officers. "They will bow as all others have bowed." But the Mamluks were unlike the frightened armies he had faced before. They moved with precision, their discipline honed by years of merciless training. Baibars, who knew the terrain well, led them swiftly through Palestine. Scouts returned with reports of the Mongol camp, their numbers, and their confidence. The spring of Ain Jalut was chosen not by chance, but by cunning. The valley was wide, but its slopes and hills provided cover. Here, the Mamluks could hide reserves, lure the Mongols in, and strike when overconfidence blinded them. Kutuz stood before his men as the sun set over the hills. His voice, hard yet steady, carried over the gathered warriors. Brothers of Islam. Today we face the terror of the age, the scourge that has burned Baghdad, that has slaughtered countless innocents. They believe we are weak. They believe we will kneel. But tomorrow, we show them that slaves may rise, that faith and steel may defy the horsemen of hell. The soldiers roared their answer, striking their spears against their shields, voices rolling like thunder. In their hearts, fear mingled with determination. They knew the stories of Mongol cruelty, entire cities put to the sword, rivers clogged with corpses. But they also knew that if they faltered here, Egypt itself would be next. And so, as the stars emerged over Ain Jalut, two armies prepared, one confident in its endless victories, the other burning with desperate courage. The dawn would decide the fate of nations. Dawn broke over the valley of Jezreel, painting the hills in shades of crimson and gold. The spring of Ain Jalut glistened like a shard of glass amidst the green fields, but its beauty was drowned by the thunder of hooves. The Mongols advanced, their banners snapping in the wind, their horsemen spreading like a dark tide across the plain. Kitbuka rode at the front, his armor gleaming, his gaze fixed upon the horizon where the Mamluks awaited. His scouts had reported their position, and he was eager to crush them swiftly. Raising his hand, he signaled the advance. Trumpets blared, drums thundered, and the horde moved as one. The Mamluks watched in silence from their lines. Baibars, sharp-eyed and calculating, gave the order to begin the ruse. At once, a detachment of cavalry surged forward, their hooves pounding, their voices echoing with fierce cries. Arrows whistled through the air, striking the Mongol front ranks. The Mongols laughed. This was the familiar dance of war. They loosed their own arrows in reply, the sky filling with a deadly storm. Mamluk horses screamed and men fell, but the attack continued. Then, suddenly, the Mamluks wheeled about and began to retreat. Kitbuka's lips curled into a savage grin. They run. The slaves flee before us, he roared. He ordered the charge, and the Mongols thundered forward, bows snapping, sabers drawn, eager to ride down the enemy. But this was no rout. Baibarza's cavalry fell back in disciplined formation, luring the Mongols deeper into the valley. Behind the hills and ravines, hidden by the folds of terrain, waited the bulk of the Mamluk army. Kutuz had concealed thousands in reserve, their banners furled, their horses restless, their bows strung. The Mongols, intoxicated with the promise of another easy victory, pressed harder. They drove the Mamluk vanguard into the narrowest part of the valley, unaware that the trap was closing around them. From his vantage point, Baibars turned in his saddle, eyes flashing with triumph. He raised his sword to the sky and shouted the words his men had been waiting for. Now! Strike as lions! The hidden Mamluk wings surged from behind the hills, descending upon the Mongols like an avalanche. Arrows blackened the air, lances leveled, war cries thundered across the valley. The hunters had become the hunted. The Mongols, caught in mid-charge, reeled in confusion. From the slopes and ravines around Ain Jalut, Mamluk cavalry poured forth in disciplined waves. The air vibrated with the hiss of arrows as clouds of shafts rained down upon the Mongol horsemen. Horses screamed, men toppled, and chaos rippled through what had been an unstoppable advance. Baibarza's feigned retreat had worked perfectly. The Mongols had been drawn into the heart of the valley, their flanks exposed, their formation stretched thin. Now, instead of chasing cowards, they found themselves encircled. Kitbuka roared his orders, rallying his men. Hold! Form! Fight them back! His warriors wheeled their mounts, loosing arrows even as they turned. Their famed discipline did not collapse at once, the Mongols were too seasoned for that, but the sting of surprise cut deep. The Mamluks pressed the advantage. Their heavy cavalry, armored head to hoof, slammed into the Mongol wings. Lances shattered against armor, swords flashed in the sunlight, shields rang with the thunder of blows. The valley erupted in a storm of steel and blood. At the center of the melee, Qutuz himself spurred forward. Casting aside caution, the Sultan raised his sword high and shouted, "O Muslims! Fight for your faith! Fight for your children! To victory, or to paradise!" His cry rolled across the battlefield, igniting the hearts of his warriors. Men who had once been slaves now fought like kings. They clashed with Mongols not with fear, but with fury. Still, the Mongols fought like demons. Their horse archery was relentless, cutting down Mamluks at range even as sabers flashed in close quarters. Kitbuka drove into the thickest fighting, his presence steadying his men. Around him, Mongols rallied again and again, refusing to yield. The valley shook with the clash, neither side willing to break. For the first time in decades, the world saw Mongols halted not by walls or attrition, but by men who dared to stand against them in open battle. The trap had sprung, but the beast was not yet slain. And in the heart of the storm, the struggle between Kitbuka and Qutuz would decide the fate of empires. The battle raged like a furnace, the valley drowning in dust and blood. Arrows fell in endless volleys, horses collided with bone-shattering force, and men grappled in the mud with daggers and bare hands. The Mongols, though ambushed, did not crumble. They fought with the savage ferocity that had shattered kingdoms from China to Baghdad. At first, the Mamluks wavered. The Mongol charge pressed hard, their arrows cutting gaps into the lines, their sabers flashing red. Panic threatened to spread among the younger soldiers, men who had never before faced the dreaded horsemen of the steppe. It was then that Qutuz acted. The Sultan tore off his gilded helmet, raised it high, and hurled it to the ground so that all might see his face. Blood streaked his cheeks, dust clung to his beard, but his eyes burned with fire. Standing tall in his stirrups, he roared with a voice that carried over the chaos. "O Muslims! Victory or martyrdom! Forward! Forward!" His cry thundered across the valley, louder than drums, stronger than horns. The Mamluks answered with a roar of their own, striking their shields and spurring their mounts. Their fear burned away, replaced by fury and faith. With renewed strength, they charged again. The flanks of the Mongols bent beneath the hammer of fresh assaults. Lances pierced armor, sabers clashed, hooves churned the earth. Baibars directed his cavalry with ruthless precision, striking where the Mongols thinned, withdrawing when they counterattacked, then striking again. He was everywhere, on one wing rallying archers, on another leading a sudden charge. His tactics turned the valley into a cage, each Mongol movement anticipated and punished. Kitbuka fought like a lion. His horse leapt into the thickest melee, his sword carving arcs of death. 3 times he broke through the Mamluk ranks, 3 times he was driven back. His fury was boundless, his defiance unshaken. To his men he shouted, "The house of Genghis does not flee." The clash swelled, neither side yielding. But the momentum had shifted. The Mamluks, inspired by their sultan's roar, pressed harder, their confidence growing with each Mongol fall. The tide of history was turning in the valley of Ain Jalut. The sun stood high over Ain Jalut, casting its merciless heat upon the blood-soaked valley. The earth trembled with the clash of hooves, the air thick with the cries of men locked in mortal combat. Both armies had bled, but the Mongols, encircled and outmaneuvered, began to feel the weight of exhaustion. Kitbuka refused to yield. The veteran general, scarred by decades of conquest, hurled himself again and again into the fiercest fighting. His saber rose and fell like a hammer, each strike felling an enemy. His horse, foaming and lathered, crashed through the lines as if carrying a force of nature itself. But no valor could reverse the trap. Baibarza's cavalry struck with relentless precision, harassing the flanks, then melting away before counterattacks. The Mongols found themselves pressed tighter into the valley, their famed mobility strangled by terrain and discipline. At last, Kitbuka's mount was struck by a spear. The beast screamed, collapsed, and hurled its rider into the dust. The Mongol general sprang to his feet, his sword flashing as he fought on foot, defiant to the last. The Mamluks surged around him, their cries echoing, "For Islam! For Qutuz!" A spear thrust caught him in the side. He staggered but swung his blade still, his face twisted in rage and pride. Another spear struck his chest, then a sword cleaved across his arm. Kitbuka sank to his knees, blood pouring, yet his voice rang out clear and fierce. "Kill me if you must. But know this, the sons of Genghis do not bow." The Mamluk struck him down. The great general of Hulagu Khan fell amidst the dust and corpses, his final defiance etched forever into history. When word spread that Kitbuka was dead, the Mongol lines shuddered. Their commander was gone, their formation broken, their spirit cracked. Some fought to the death, others turned to flee. The steppe warriors who had crushed kingdoms now felt the bite of panic. Qutuz raised his sword high, shouting so all could hear. "The Mongols are broken. Press them. Press them until none remain." And with a roar, the Mamluks surged forward, the tide of the battle finally turning beyond doubt. The horde had met its first true defeat. The death of Kitbuka shattered the Mongol army. Once a force that had seemed like the wrath of heaven itself, their lines wavered, their cries lost in the thunder of Mamluk steel. The discipline that had carried them across half the world dissolved into chaos. Some Mongols fought on in desperate fury, hacking and slashing even as they were surrounded. Others broke away, spurring their horses to flee the valley, only to find Baibars's cavalry closing the exits like jaws of a trap. Arrows rained down upon them from the hillsides, striking men and mounts alike. The Mamluks pressed relentlessly. Their heavy cavalry drove into the disordered enemy, shields locked, lances leveled. Ashigaru archers on horseback unleashed volley after volley, cutting down those who tried to regroup. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse. Qutuz, still bareheaded, his face streaked with blood and dust, led from the front. His sword rose and fell, his voice hoarse from shouting commands. "Do not let them escape. Strike them until the valley runs red." The Mongols had never known such defeat. In China, in Persia, in Baghdad, they had been the hunters. Now, for the first time, they were prey. Horses stumbled over corpses, warriors fell into the mud, screams filled the air. One contingent managed to break free, galloping toward the north, hoping to reach the safety of Syria. But Baibars had foreseen it. His cavalry intercepted them, cutting them down before they could escape. The valley of Ain Jalut became a tomb. By the day's end, the once mighty horde lay broken. Thousands of Mongol corpses littered the fields, their banners trampled, their reputation shattered. Survivors scattered into the hills, carrying with them the unthinkable news: the sons of Genghis Khan had been defeated. The Mamluks gathered, weary but triumphant. Their cheers rose into the sky, their voices shaking the valley. "Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar!" For the first time in living memory, the terror of the Mongols had been stopped in its tracks. The tide of history had turned at Ain Jalut. As the dust settled over Ain Jalut, the battlefield lay strewn with the bodies of Mongol warriors who, only days before, had seemed invincible. Broken banners fluttered weakly in the wind, their once feared symbols now smeared with mud and blood. Horses wandered aimlessly, riderless, their hooves sinking into the crimson earth. The Mamluks, battered but unbroken, gathered in ranks. Exhaustion weighed upon them, yet in their eyes burned the light of triumph. They had accomplished what no army before them had managed: they had defeated the Mongols in open battle. Qutuz rode before his soldiers, his face hard but proud. Raising his sword to the heavens, he cried out, "Praise be to Allah! Today the world knows that the Mongols are not invincible. Today we have avenged Baghdad, Aleppo, Damascus. Today, Islam stands free." His men answered with a roar of "Allahu Akbar" that rolled through the valley like thunder. Some fell to their knees in prayer, others wept openly, gripping their bloodied swords. For them, this was more than victory, it was salvation. Baibars, the architect of the ambush, stood beside Kutuz, his eyes sharp even amidst the celebration. He knew the victory was not merely military but political. The Mongols' aura of fear had been shattered, and with it the submission of countless cities and rulers. From Cairo to Mecca, from the Mediterranean to the Tigris, word would spread that the Mamluks had stood firm while others had crumbled. The surviving Mongols fled north, their power in Syria broken. No longer would the horde advance unchecked into Egypt and beyond. For the first time in decades, the tide of conquest had been turned back. In the camp that night, fires burned bright, and songs filled the air. Soldiers recounted their moments of valor, the clash of steel, the fall of Kitbuka. They spoke not as slaves, but as men who had written history with their blades. And though the valley reeked of death, it also carried the scent of rebirth. The Mamluks had proven themselves not merely as rulers of Egypt, but as defenders of the entire Islamic world. The legend of Ain Jalut had been born. The victory at Ain Jalut did not remain confined to the dusty valley of Jezreel. Like a stone cast into still water, its ripples spread far and wide, shaking the foundations of empires. In the Islamic world, despair gave way to hope. Cities that had trembled at the approach of Mongol hooves now lifted their heads in defiance. In Cairo, the news was greeted with jubilant celebration. The call to prayer rang out as if the city itself was singing. Scholars and imams declared it a miracle, a sign that Allah had not abandoned his people. Mothers told their children that the tide of destruction had been broken, that faith and courage had triumphed over terror. In Damascus and Aleppo, still scarred by Mongol conquest, whispers grew louder: the Mamluks had succeeded where all others had failed. The image of Mongol invincibility, so carefully carved through decades of conquest, was shattered. Even in Europe, the shockwaves were felt. Kings and popes, who had watched helplessly as Mongol riders thundered across Asia and Eastern Europe, now heard of their defeat at the hands of a Muslim army. Some rejoiced, relieved that the storm from the east had been checked. Others grew uneasy, realizing that the balance of power in the Near East had shifted. Cairo, not Christendom, had halted the horde. For the Mongols, the defeat was a scar. Hulagu Khan, upon hearing of Kitbuka's death and the rout of his forces, raged with fury. Yet he was unable to avenge it. The great empire itself was fracturing in civil war after the death of Monk Khan. Ain Jalut had struck not only a military blow, but a symbolic one. It proved that the Mongols were not invincible, that resistance was not futile. Among the Mamluks, the names of Kutuz and Baibars became immortal. Kutuz, the sultan who had thrown off his helmet and roared for victory, embodied courage and faith. Baibars, whose strategy had sprung the trap, embodied cunning and foresight. Together, they had not only saved Egypt but had changed the course of world history. The world looked upon Ain Jalut and saw the first true fracture in the Mongol tide. And in that fracture, hope returned to nations that had forgotten what hope was. The battlefield of Ain Jalut grew silent in the days after the clash, but its legacy thundered across centuries. For the first time since Genghis Khan had unleashed his riders upon the world, the Mongols had been stopped, not by walls or plague, but by men who dared to face them in open war. For the Mamluks, the victory was transformative. No longer mere slave soldiers who had seized power in Egypt, they became the guardians of Islam, defenders of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. The names of Kutuz and Baibars were etched into memory: Kutuz, the lion who roared amidst the storm, and Baibars, the cunning general whose strategy had ensnared the mightiest of foes. Their triumph at Ain Jalut gave the Mamluk Sultanate legitimacy and prestige that would endure for generations. The Mongols, once the terror of the earth, were forced to reckon with mortality. Hulagu Khan raged at Kitbuka's death, but the internal struggles of the Mongol Empire, the great succession crisis following Monk Khan's passing, meant he could not avenge the defeat. The dream of extending Mongol dominion across North Africa died in the valley of Jezreel. Ain Jalut marked the westernmost boundary of their expansion. In the Islamic world, the battle became legend. Preachers told it as proof of divine intervention, poets immortalized it in verse, and warriors took inspiration from it for generations. It was remembered as the day when slaves became kings, when faith and courage triumphed over despair. Even beyond the Middle East, Ain Jalut became a symbol. To kingdoms that had known only fear of Mongol conquest, Hungary, Poland, Russia, it showed that resistance was not in vain. To Christendom, it was a moment of uneasy admiration, that it had been the Muslims, not the Crusaders, who had delivered the first great wound to the Mongol horde. The valley itself, where David had once slain Goliath, bore witness again to the fall of a giant. And so the Battle of Ain Jalut became more than history, it became myth. A reminder that even the mightiest empire could be humbled, that even the fiercest storm could be broken by resolve. From the dust of Jezreel rose a truth that outlived the warriors who fought there: no power is eternal, and no conqueror is invincible.